The internet is cracked, the show that asks the question, can we coexist with our creation?
Hello, I'm Seth Camillo.
And I am Caroline Risberg, and we are The Internet is Cracked by Addicts for Addicts.
And today we are very, very lucky to have Dr. Alice E. Marwick with us. She is the Director of Research at the Data and Society Research Institute, and most recently the author of The Private is Political, Networked Privacy on Social Media, and it's published by the Yale Press. The book examines how the networked nature of online privacy disproportionately impacts members of marginalized communities. So we are so lucky to have you. So excited to talk to you.
Oh, well, thanks for having me on. I'm excited to be here.
Wonderful.
Thank you for being here.
So could you talk to us about the idea of authenticity in humanity at this point?
Yeah, that's such a great question because I think it's really at the heart of so many issues around online identity and also things like advertising and influencer culture as well. So I got interested in this back in the day when I was doing research on stuff like, MySpace and LiveJournal and YouTube and sort of the internet platforms that are around sort of the early age of social media. And what was really interesting to me is that you have all of these spaces online where when you ask people, like, what's important to you when you're following someone, they'll be like, oh, someone who's authentic, right? And so what that means, though, is totally dependent on what sort of subculture or milieu that person is in. So let's take something like a beauty blogger, right? So for somebody like a beauty blogger, being authentic basically means like, when I review a product, I'm telling you what I really think about it, not like that I'm being paid to say that it's great. But in reality, most people who are professional internet personalities, like they make most of their money through sponsored content, right? So
Yeah.
there's this sort of, and at the same time, in order to be successful online, you really have to spend a lot of time working towards it. Like you have to professionally produce your content. You have to plan out an editorial schedule or whatever it is, right? But you have to seem like you don't want that. You have to seem like you're not looking for people to follow you. It's like there's sort of performance of effortlessness. But I think this trickles down to even like your average internet user as well, because none of us want to be seen as being inauthentic online. And when you tell people like, well, what does that mean? Like to be inauthentic, they're always just comparing it to something else, right? So if you think of like the least authentic person you can think of, like a total sellout, like someone who's gotten tons of plastic surgery, someone who cheats at video games, whatever it is, right? Like whatever your definition of authenticity is, you're basically assessing someone based on how they live up to this like false idea of authenticity. But it's not a real thing. Like even when you're talking to somebody face to face in a room, there's still an element of performance, right? We're still different around different people and in different spaces.
Yes.
Like if you think about a really difficult situation like a job interview or like a first date, right? You're hyper aware of how you come off in those situations.
Yeah.
You're like, like, am I sweating? Did I say something silly? Um, but even when you're hanging out with your friends, you're different with them than you would be with like your parents or your boss. And so what you're choosing to present to people is always like a facet of yourself, like a particular slice of yourself. And so online, a lot of the time, I feel like we end up kind of just going with like, what's the lowest common denominator? Like, what can I talk about online that isn't going to make people mad, that isn't going to make people think I'm a flake, that I'm not going to share stuff about, my mental health struggles or maybe some dumb pop culture thing that I like. And so it's all wrapped up, I think, in the sense of there are some people who do share those struggles. And I think their audience tends to think of them as very authentic, but they're still doing that with a boundary, right? There's always things that we don't share online.
When I see my friends, my actual friends, not just friends that happen to be I connected to on a social media platform, people I've grown up with, their Facebook feed, their Instagram feed, their whatever does not accurately depict the people I know. And I think, oh,
That's
But
true.
that's probably true for myself as well.
Well, I would think the same for me actually too. I noticed with some of the friends, I'm like, okay, this seems a little bit different.
In the early internet where there was a lot more pseudonymity or anonymity, I used to write a live journal when I was in my early 20s, and I would write about like the most personal things. And it was totally public, and it was under a
Mm,
pseudonym that I've used for years, but that is very easily connected to my real name. But I just assumed the audience for it was, like, tiny, and it was. Like, my parents would never have found it, like, nobody I worked
mm,
with would have ever found it. But nowadays, I never have that presumption, right? Like, even when I'm posting on Reddit under an alt account, I'm always like, "What if this got associated with
oh,
my professional persona?" Right? It's
mm,
because
mm,
everyone is online and the internet is so connected to our offline worlds.
right.
It's really hard to kind of experiment with your identity or play with your identity online or sort of try things out, right? Like the way that teenagers might try out different
Mhm,
kind of
mhm.
personas. Like that stuff is really hard because it's so persistent online now.
Yeah. So if algorithm kind of shapes what we see too, right?
Yes.
So what extent are we truly ourselves in like nowadays, you know?
I mean, I think the idea that we are a self that is like always the same and that there is some sort of like authentic inner self, like
Mhm.
everyone thinks that, but I just don't really believe it. Like we have a
Yeah,
sense of
no.
self, right? Like you think you know who you are. But when you think about your life, especially if you're like, middle aged and you've been around
Right.
for a little while, you've gone through a lot of different sort of phases of your life. And that doesn't mean that that was inauthentic. It just means that you've changed, right?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
but we have this, like, really strong sense that, like, we have an inner self, and that's the true self, and, like, you should express your true self, and I don't know if that really helps people, that discourse,
Hmm.
honestly.
Mm, mhm.
I don't know if you know who Kevin Durant is, the basketball player, and he set up I mean, this guy's Kevin Durant's one of the probably consistently one of the, 3 to 5 best basketball players in the NBA, and he set up if I'm correct, he set up a fake account so that he could get mad at the people that were criticizing him.
Is that right?
Yeah, and I mean, this is a guy who's worth hundreds of millions of dollars
Yep.
and has won, I believe, MVP of the league. I mean, and won multiple NBA championships. And he felt the need. He was so injured by random fans that he set up a fake account that was discovered in which he would, as they say, clap back at his critics, which is kind of amazing that we are all that insecure, even 6 foot
Yeah.
10 NBA MVPs.
I don't know if it's insecurity. I think it is very human to be hurt when people say mean things about you, and in our day-to-day lives, most of us who aren't, like, global celebrities, most of the time, most people are not saying mean things about us, at least not to our face, right?
Right,
Like,
right.
think about the backlash if there's like a leaked group chat or one of your friends comes to you and is like, oh, so and so was talking smack about you
Yeah.
behind your back,
Yeah,
right? Like, that's like a very hurtful thing.
yeah.
But we kind of assume that when people get to a certain level of notoriety online, and I'm not even talking about people with like, 100 million Instagram followers, I'm talking about people with like 6,000 Twitter followers, right? There's this presumption that, like, what happens on the internet shouldn't count or that it shouldn't hurt your feelings.
Mhm.
But, I mean, I could even imagine someone like, Taylor Swift. Like, I think these people do take criticism personally, and I
Oh,
think the
yeah.
thing is that,
I
like,
do too. I do too.
yeah, I mean, her whole last album, Taylor Swift had a bunch of songs about sort of responding to fans. Sorry, I'm a little bit of a Swiftie, but,
Okay.
uh, hopefully you don't hold that against me.
No, I
Um
think everyone is.
Yeah, but I think the thing is that, like, this used to be a position that most people would never be in, right? Because most people
Right.
they did not have a public presence, like, unless you were, a television star, a pop star, movie star, politician. But now there's so many jobs where having a public presence is part of the
Mm.
job.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that opens you up to public criticism, and yet you don't have the tools to deal with that, like, Beyoncé has, right? Where she has, like, a team and agents and managers and bodyguards, like, you're just a regular person.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's true. I mean, you always have heard like the, let's say, stars to say, you know what, I never read the critics. I can't because it hurts, you know. And now, I mean, on social media, I'm sure they get bombarded, but you're right. They have a wall around them that try to protect them, but the normal kid doesn't.
I think the internet sort of it creates this sphere of critique, and it encourages everybody to be critical, and it sort of assumes that if you're on the internet at all, then you should be subject to critique.
Yeah, a lot of people would say nice things, but about films I have made online, but then people would say hurtful things, and to be honest, I really kept the hurtful things closer to my heart than I did
Yeah,
the nice things, and
yeah.
that was something that wasn't available before the internet. The average person didn't have a chance to tell me they hated my film. I mean, really hated it. People were, and it's like, it hurts. It does hurt. Even if you
But
get
that's just
you
pure mean. That's just mean. Like when people go, like as you said, like say, why would somebody go out and say something really mean? Because you know it's hurtful.
but I think
But
the question for you as studying the internet is the fact that those voices couldn't be heard
Yeah.
beforehand,
right,
and now those voices are heard. They would say
yeah,
that to their partner after watching the film, but not me.
Have you talked about Gamergate at all on this show?
no,
No.
Okay, so that I think Gamergate is a absolute watershed moment in the modern internet. And for your listeners who may not remember it, this was a internet campaign around, I think it was 2013 or so, where it started out with a particular female video game journalist who was accused of sleeping with she was a video game developer, and she was sort of accused of using a romantic relationship with a video game journalist to get favorable coverage for her game. Um, and then it sort of broadened into this attack on a bunch of other visible female video game
mm,
developers. And it became this targeted campaign that was coordinated over spaces like, you know, 4chan and I think at the time, honestly, Reddit, because Reddit was a very different place 10 years ago than it is now. And it resulted in really, really horrible, outcomes, like death threats,
oh
revenge
no,
porn, what we would now call, like, deep fakes, and these women were basically bullied off the internet, and in some cases, their lives were threatened, and it was because they dared to be a woman on the internet
oh
talking about
wow,
video games. And those people's lives, like, they often have to move house, they're scared for their kids' lives, and we did nothing about this online harassment then, and it's really, really hard to prosecute legally because often the people harassing you they're not just not in the same state. Sometimes they're not even in the same hemisphere, right? Like,
No.
oh
all
yeah,
kinds of
yeah,
issues. But it becomes this sort of weapon that can be used to systematically shut down issues that people don't like, and that that's not great.
There's something happening in which this promise of free speech is leading to outcomes that were unintended, I think, especially with marginalized, groups. Could you speak to that a little bit? If you think I'm right.
We have this communication platform. The internet is
mm,
a communication platform
mm-hmm,
that allows for the loudest voices to be heard, right?
yeah,
And if you think about pre-internet era, right? There were far fewer viewpoints in public discourse. Like you
right,
did not hear from people outside the mainstream a lot of the time. Like there's huge movements around feminism and civil rights and queer
yeah,
rights that at least partially have to do with like the media coverage of issues that were important to these communities just like not happening. So the promise of the internet is like a diversity of opinions in the public sphere, and we think of that as a good thing generally, right? Like
right,
I want to hear from like union members in a discussion about labor. I don't just want to hear from the head of some billionaire corporation and the labor secretary. Like I want to hear these different points of view. In reality, the media is still stuck on a pretty fixed set of opinions, and they have not really, I think, widened their sourcing or the sort of like, spectrum of public opinions that you hear. But what you do have is you have social media movements where you have things like Black Lives Matter and Me Too, where people are like, these are voices that are being left out of the public sphere, and we're going to use the internet to voice our experiences and our points of view.
Right.
And I think most people would agree, like, great, wonderful, good. The problem is when those kinds of ideas and voices are coming up against like I would say like the centers of power, right?
Mhm,
Or sort of
mhm.
people's opinions of like how the world should be. Like not everybody wants to give up privilege, not everyone wants to make things more diverse, not everybody wants there to be gender diversity, right? Some people are very married to this concept of like a binary gender system, and they are going to resist very hard discussions that challenge that.
Right.
And that's human too. People do, not even big C conservative, but people do tend to be conservative about, the things that they've grown up believing. And these things can be very difficult to incorporate into your worldview, especially if you're older. But the problem
Mm.
is that you then have a minority being shouted out by a more powerful majority, where the more powerful majority is framing themselves as a victim. And that is the stuff that really bothers me, is this like victimization rhetoric. Like, oh, as a Christian, I'm being victimized because I have to take Hanukkah and Kwanzaa, into account when it's Christmas time. Or, as a woman, I'm being oppressed because I now have to share women's spaces with trans women. Like,
Right, I
so
see what you mean. Yeah.
you see what I mean? So you've got these,
Yeah.
like, really, really difficult power dynamics, and the thing is that we have never had a country where everyone had these viewpoints out and about at the same time. But now on social media, even if you're from, like, the smallest, whitest, most conservative place in the world, you
Mhm.
can go on social media and you can see a really diverse array of people talking about things, and you're probably gonna heavily disagree with some of those points of view in the same way that I would disagree with some points of view that I see on social media. The problem is, what do you do when you get to
Right.
that point of disagreement? And we're at a point where incivility and political violence and polarization and partisanship are so hate-filled,
Yeah.
and it feels some days like a powder keg, this country, with the way people are treating each other, are talking to each other. And I think part of that is because when you deny, like, it's very hard to have a conversation if one group of people are like, well, I deny your basic right to exist or your
Mm.
right to have basic civil rights. Like, how do you start from is how do you have a commonality there?
'Cause I actually feel like, social media in many ways divides us. I think we were supposed to
Yeah.
become together, but we actually divides us.
Well, I think a good analogy is thinking about the civil rights movement, right?
Right.
Because nowadays we think of Martin Luther King as this kind of like cuddly character that everybody liked, but he was one of the most hated men in
Right.
America
Yeah.
at his heyday. And most of a large majority, I wouldn't say a majority, but a very large percentage of the country opposed desegregation, opposed,
Yeah.
integrated schools, opposed civil rights. And the only reason that we made forward progress is because they were forced to change because the legal system changed and said you no
Uh,
longer can have segregated schools. And even given that, you've still seen pockets all over the country where there's resegregation and there's,
yeah.
all kinds of, I mean, this stuff takes a really, really long time to go away, but you need to have these legal safeguards in place, right? Like when gay marriage was legalized, who cares if you don't like gay marriage? Like it's legal. Like you don't have to like it, right?
Right, it's true, true, right, yes. That makes
But
sense.
it's not just about people's opinions, right? There have to be like these strong legal safeguards in place to protect minority rights. And
Yeah.
if those things are being protected or being upheld, then these conflicts of opinion matter less. But when they're not, or when they're tenuous, as I think they are now, and I recognize this is not like a contemporary politics podcast.
That's what
um,
no, it is
That's
whatever it is.
okay because everything
yeah,
yeah, all of
you
this
It's
know,
is
about the
in
internet, so it's
yeah,
yeah.
it
I mean,
that's
the
is.
part of
internet
it.
is life, right? Like
Yeah,
Yeah.
it
life is
is.
the internet. Internet is life.
These are related somehow. I'm not sure how they are, or maybe you can help me out. Since you have a PhD. Um,
That is no guarantee of intelligence, let me tell you.
I feel like these things are related. We're talking about free speech and like, oh, well, you don't need to be on Facebook, but there is something when you have 4.2 billion users, 3.2 of which are daily users, and that 4.2 represents like 80 or 90% of total internet users. There's a responsibility beyond, I think, beyond being a company. Um, when, you know, you not control, but facilitate that much of the conversation, not being able to be part of that conversation is a big deal.
Yeah.
And number 2, I would say, since the internet has come along, I've actually heard people say for the first time in my life, I started to hear people like say they don't like Martin Luther King. And that was something that like I can remember the first time I heard somebody say that, I was just weirded out because I was like, "Well, wait a minute, like, isn't that like he's an American hero
Yeah.
to 100% of people, but he's not."
Yeah.
And the internet, I feel like,
Mm.
has made that louder. So I don't know how those 2
Yeah.
things it's like a dependence, and then we have these bad outcomes. How do we rectify the 2 things, I guess is what I'm
Mm.
saying.
It's a really, really challenging problem, and I think when we get into stuff like disinformation, there's been this really successful move from conservatives to say that scholarship on disinformation or moderation of disinformation is censorship, right?
Mhm.
If you think about the pandemic, right, like, people were dying in large numbers, and it is irresponsible to put out false information during a medical emergency.
Right.
And if you think about, like, the wildfires in California, right, or the floods in North Carolina, there are situations in which inaccurate information can put people's lives at risk. So it's preposterous to say, like, "Oh, we should just let everyone say whatever false information they want online." The problem is that who is assessing what information is true and what
Right.
information is false, right? Like,
Mhm.
I don't think anyone wants Mark Zuckerberg to do that, but the American government has never, and as far as I can tell, is not going to pass any kind of internet regulation. Like, they have just allowed internet companies to run unchecked. So there is not an easy solution to this stuff. It's not as easy as being like Facebook hire more moderators or let's use AI to moderate things or just let everyone say what they want. Like, all of those solutions will fail.
My sense is that this whole, like, Martin Luther King was a rabble rouser comes from the internet. Maybe it was always there and people just didn't say it, but so is it that it was always there and people didn't say it, and now people feel free to say it because of the internet, or has it metastasized because of the internet? I don't I'm not sure where it's
I
coming from.
I think it's metastasized because of the internet. So
Mm.
I one of the things that I study online is far right disinformation. So I've spent hundreds of hours of my life in white supremacist groups online and reading their text messages and their
Oh, wow.
group chats and things like that. Yeah. Fun stuff. Very
I
uplifting.
I
Uh, And one of the things that's super interesting about internet-based white supremacists, right? Because not all white supremacists are the same. Like, you've got your kind of street thug, kind of skinhead Nazi people, and then you've got like
right.
these internet nerds that spend all their time constructing elaborate political arguments for why white supremacy is justified. And in a lot of these communities, they're digging up these old racist books that are going back to on one internet forum, they were discussing Martin Luther's On the Jews and Their Lies, which I believe was published in the 1400s. And they're excavating all these racist texts from like the 1800s and 1900s, and they're putting them as free PDFs and they're sharing them, right?
Mm.
And so even back in the early 90s, the white supremacists were really savvy users of the internet. Like Stormfront, which is this enormous white supremacist site, has been online since like 96 or something like that.
Oh,
Hmm.
wow.
Yeah, and, one of my, a colleague of mine, Jessie Daniels, who's a professor at the CUNY Graduate Center, she studies online white supremacy, and she found even in the late '90s that there was a white supremacist group who had bought this domain. I can't remember what it was, but it was like mlk.net or something like that. And if you went to that site, at first it looked like a legitimate educational site about Martin Luther King. Like it had a picture of him and, I have a dream. But as soon as you drilled down into it, you saw that it was all white supremacist propaganda, that were all these like hateful lies about Martin Luther King and all the bad things that he did. And so
Uh,
she was really interested in this phenomenon of what she called cloaked sites, which are sites they don't have like the KKK on them, right? Like they're not clearly white supremacists. What they're trying to do is to kind of bring people in who are maybe you're in third grade and you're doing a book report on Martin Luther King, right? And you find this site.
oh,
And so you find yourself espousing white supremacist ideas unknowingly. And so I think what a lot of far right actors have done really successfully is they've popularized a lot of ideas that before that only existed in far right spaces that were like very small and mostly underground. Like if you're a white supremacist in like Greenwich, Connecticut or something 20 years ago, you're going to find it very hard to find other people who are like you.
Yeah.
The
er,
internet makes it possible with people for all kinds of niche interests to connect. And unfortunately, it makes it very easy for hateful racists and
mm,
conspiracy theorists and all other types of people with fringe political beliefs to get together and egg each other on and share information and convince each other that they're right.
Yeah.
oh, it's so horrible.
Yeah, I'm just a feel-good ray of sunshine
Oh
in
my
my
god.
research
Yeah.
program.
Wait, no, but this is so extremely interesting. Like how, for example, I was thinking, Nazi Germany, right? Just to go back to something because we talked about white supremacists. How I don't, Germans itself are not bad people, but what happened? And this is way before social media or anything, like how they trigger or go on people. Like that, I think that's a phenomenon kind of too. And this, what you're saying, is kind of in this, but in a much bigger, large, it becomes worldwide, not just in one country. This is
Yeah.
those groups are, I mean, they're evil,
And they do coordinate across borders, right? Like,
right?
you've seen the rise of the far right across Europe, and you see them communicating a lot with members of the American far right. We're even seeing this in mainstream politics nowadays.
Mm-hmm.
And so back in 2016, when I started studying this stuff, you know, the thing we were all worried about at the time was this desire to open the Overton window, which means that you're expanding the range of ideas that are acceptable in American political discourse. And in general, American political discourse kind of goes between the center right to the center left. Like you don't hear a lot of like white supremacists, but you don't hear a lot of anarchists either. Like there's a very
Yeah.
limited amount of political opinions that are voiced in mainstream media, like
Yeah.
very limited. Like in Europe, you'll definitely hear more socialist opinions. You will not hear that in American media, mostly because of McCarthyism, but that's a whole other conversation. Um, but I think that the far right was really successful in opening the Overton window. Anti-trans ideas, anti-immigrant
Mm-hmm.
ideas, even these regressive ideas about women not being in the military and trad wives. Like these are all ideas that come out of far right circles, get picked up by like little tiny blogs and social media, and then start making their way up the ladder of mainstream politics. And it's sad for me because I've spent most of my career studying things that people do on the internet, and increasingly, it seems that the things people do on the internet are destructive. I think the internet had such potential. I think it could have been the most incredible artistic and communication tool that humanity had ever known, and it's as someone who was, like, a very enthusiastic internet user, from the time that I got online with a modem in '94, it has been very sad for me to see these developments. It makes me think that we were just all, like, completely wrong. Like, it's I feel like a lot of people in my generation have had a real reckoning over the last, like, 5 to 10 years.
If somebody came to me with the idea that, hey, I'm going to create this online thing where we all get to talk together all the time and, we have to express ideas and your friends are going to be on it. I mean, it all sounds so wonderful. And then
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
practice, it you know, it's not. And why is that? Is this humanity at work, or is this the internet at work?
I'm going to use the first year grad student's PhD answer and say that it's capitalism.
Okay.
Uh,
Mhm.
um, I've been scoping out, so I'm writing this book on online radicalization right now, and after I'm done, I need a palate cleanser kind of project. And
Yeah.
so I really want to write a book on early pre Facebook social media. And I want to write about LiveJournal. And so
Mm,
no one under the age of 40 is even gonna know what LiveJournal is,
right.
but I mentioned it earlier. It's this online site where you would just write your journal every day, and you would have this little group of people who read it, and you would all read each other's journals, and you would comment on it. And it created this extremely tight-knit community of people to the point where, like, I met my husband on LiveJournal. I met
Oh.
oh yeah, I know, I'm a real nerd. I met a lot of my close, close friends on LiveJournal, and a lot of my internet friendships that have lasted for more than 20 years are because I met people on a medium where people were sharing their thoughts and feelings
Mm,
about things without worrying about their boss looking over their shoulder or their parents looking over their shoulder. It does allow for those kinds of communicative relationships between strangers, in a way that's incredibly powerful. It's not about the site trying to keep you on the site for as long as possible by
right.
prioritizing sensationalist content. It's not about people being professional content creators who have to make more and more frenetic videos to get more and more views, right? It was just a thing people did for fun online with their friends. Now, I'm not sure if anything like that would ever be possible today because I think at least part of the joy of it was that the internet was a much smaller community in
Right.
2001 than it is now. It was just the sheer number of people online was infinitesimal compared to the number of people online
Right.
today, right?
Yeah.
But I think it does speak to the promise of a lot of these things. The fact that our online communication is basically controlled by Meta and Google and and ByteDance and like three other companies, none of whom care at all about letting people communicate, right? All they care about is online advertising and money. Like,
Yeah.
they're not social scientists, they're not educators, they're not journalists, they're not
Right.
filmmakers, they just care about money. And so I think that these tools, which were originally created for scientists to share information with each other, have just been completely perverted by advertising and capitalism. So that's my semi-Marxist rant.
It makes sense to me.
It makes total sense to me. I have a question I just thought of, like, with if you are a innocent child, I would say child, let's say you're 16, you don't have any, you have no thoughts of white supremacist or your parents are normal and all this kind
Yeah.
of thing, and you are going online because I do have heard like how to get
Yeah.
especially younger kids. uh I mean, you sitting there and they go online looking for things. How do they get you? How do they get a kid to radicalize them? Or I know that certain criminal groups, for example, I'm Swedish, but I live here in America. But I know, for example, in Sweden, they have now there are certain groups that goes in and take. I think is if you're under 17 or something, you won't get any prison time. So they make the
Mhm.
kids do the
Mhm.
crimes. I mean, and there actually been even shootings. Like how do they get an innocent kid?
So when you look at who they're looking for young men in the same way that
Right.
the military has always recruited young men. Like, young men are the most likely to take action on their ideals. They're easily swayed in some ways. And I think, and I say this as someone who is a feminist and does feminist work, I think there is a lack of positive identity for young men today, especially
Mm,
young white men. It's not just that I have 2 kids, I have a boy and a girl, and the number of books there are for girls that are like brave heroines and girls are great and spunky and da da da. Yes, there's tons and tons of books in which boys are the protagonists, but there's very few books or media in general that's talking about masculine identity. And I will say the only reason that stuff exists for women is because women made it. right? Because of the
Yeah.
feminist movement. Like women created those things. But men have not done the same thing for masculine identity. They haven't deconstructed it. They haven't pushed back against the really negative things about masculine identity that are hurtful to men. And so a lot of boys, I think, are growing up in this space where they don't feel like they have a good understanding of what it means to be a man in a way that isn't toxic and hurtful. So maybe they're not great with girls, right? Or maybe they
Mm.
don't know what's going on with themselves, or maybe they're insecure about something. And so a lot of spaces online that are made for young men to socialize, whether it's around gaming or anime or whatever it is, like whatever,
Mm.
even sports, although sports maybe a little less, but certainly these more like subcultural spaces. These are the spaces that are used often to sort of like pull the young men in because it's about saying, hey, look, don't let anyone make you feel bad for being a white man. You should be proud to be a white man. Here's all the great things that
Oh.
white men have done. And then they'll be like, here's European, architecture. Here's, classical Greece and Rome. Like this was all done by white men. And then it gets from just celebrate your identity, like don't let anyone push you around, take what you deserve, and then it gets into denigrating other groups to sort of hold up the ideal of positive masculinity. So I think here there is this vacuum that is being filled by people like Andrew Tate and these kind of like manosphere male supremacists. There's a vacuum around positive male identity, things that young men can be proud of being a young man, that they can do
Mhm.
things that are positive and constructive and make them feel good about themselves and their families and their communities and their friends. Um, that's just not there. And
Mm.
so I understand why young people get drawn into this stuff, and I understand why young men feel abandoned. I don't think it's women's responsibility to fix that for them, though. I think this is something where you are going to need to go through some kind of social movement that is similar
Mm.
to feminism, where men are saying, like, hey, look, actually, this what people call toxic masculinity has really been very bad for a lot of men. And we have to start thinking about better ways to be men in the 21st century now that it's not just all about being, a provider or being a big,
Right.
strong guy or something like that. Like, let's rethink some of these things in the same way that women have rethought what it means to be a woman.
So, I mean, the internet is crack, and what is our question? Can we coexist with our creation? And I think probably Caroline and I believe you can't coexist with your creation in the way that we are currently coexisting with our creation.
Yeah, I don't think it's sustainable for people's mental health. I really don't.
In my opinion, yeah, what you said was so on the mark. In its current state, it's not sustainable for human mental health.
Yeah.
And I don't know how that's changed because of your first year graduate student answer, capitalism. I you can't you can't pry those 2 things apart, so how do you make it work? And I don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's easy. I don't think it's easy to define the problem, but I think we have a better understanding of it now than we ever did before. So then it's like, okay, well, what are the solution spaces? And one solution space is the tech companies voluntarily decide to make all their products better. That is not going to happen. They are beholden to their shareholders. They need to continue to grow. They're not going to do something that turns people off the product. So that's just not going to happen. The second thing is, can we rely on government regulation to solve some of these things? Now, we've seen efforts in some areas, right? Like the European Union has put forth the GDPR, the Digital Services Act. In the UK, we have the Online Safety Bill. There are these efforts, right? The problem is that all of these efforts need heavy enforcement, and they also need to actually hit the platforms where it hurts. If your company is making billions and billions of dollars, even finding them $1 million, they don't care. That's like just the cost of doing business, right? So for
Oh.
there to be regulations, there have to be enforcement mechanisms that can actually change things. And I'm not, especially with now the US being in such an anti-regulatory mode, I'm
Right.
not convinced that we're in a space where that's going to happen. So then the third thing is like people create better social platforms and people sort of abandon the old social platforms organically because they're
Right.
so terrible. And I do think we're seeing some of that. Like if you look at Facebook, nobody under 35 uses Facebook. Like, if you go up to some teenager and are like, "Are you on Facebook?" They'll look at you like you have 2 heads, right? Like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Facebook makes its money off Instagram from kids, right? Like, they don't make and even young and even I think Instagram is less popular with youth now than it used to be. And I think there is a space for kind of more indie or smaller or but so many of these platforms, as soon as they get to a certain level, they realize like, "Oh, we actually have to make money here. We're not satisfied just being like a small little company that employs 100 people. We want to be this big global behemoth." And then they scale. So, as long as the incentive structure is like, well, by mining user data and selling micro-targeted advertising, you can make billions of dollars on the internet. It can't just be like out of the goodness of people's heart, they create better products.
Obviously, quote unquote, the algorithm is artificial intelligence before we started deeming things to be artificial intelligence. But as
Mm,
things get more, uh, artificial intelligence works its way into our world more and more effectively, what do you think
mm,
is going to happen with social media and our interactions with technology in general?
I mean, that's the question that everybody wants the answer to, right? And I
right.
can I can say that obviously I don't know, but I have a few guesses. The first is that it will make the things that are already bad worse, because it allows for all those things to be scaled. Again, I'll go back to Facebook. If you do log on to Facebook these days, and you scroll through your feed, you're going to see a lot of content that you did not ask to see that Facebook is pushing to you far more than there was 10 years ago.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
And of that content, a lot of it is from these like absolute garbage Facebook groups where a lot of the content is AI generated slop. And there are hundreds of people commenting on a picture that is clearly fake and being like, wow, amazing. I've never seen anything like that. And I think what worries me about artificial intelligence is that it means that we already have a very hard time discerning between like I'm gonna use the term authentic, but just like
Mhm,
content that was generated by AI and content that was not generated by AI.
mhm.
We're and it's as AI gets better, it's going to be much, much more difficult to differentiate the two, which means that you can dismiss virtually anything by saying that it's AI generated, right? So on one hand, you're going to have more deep fakes and more identity theft and things like that. On the other hand, when people do produce authentic content, it can be easily called into question by saying that it's generated by AI. So, insofar as I think we already have this sort of crisis of institutional trust, I think that's going to get much worse. If I can think of some positive things about AI, I do think that is I think that most search engines right now are so terrible. Like Google has
Mhm,
gotten so wretched that I think AI, if we could sort of clean up its environmental impacts, which are very, very bad, right? Like I think it's
mhm.
very hard to use AI ethically right now just because its environmental impacts are so enormous. But I do think that there are things that AI can do in terms of like, you know, making mundane tasks a little easier, helping you write emails. Like, I think all those things are probably might be good for some people. But I think it's gonna have a lot of downstream impacts on, like, your average worker, whether and
Right,
because AI is going to be increasingly integrated into the tools that workers have to use.
right,
And I think a lot of what it's gonna do is it's going to increase things like worker surveillance, worker datafication, these kind of pre-existing processes where workers are increasingly kind of, like, trapped when they're at work, right? And, like, they're being watched the whole time. So we're in a really weird transition period right now, and I think one of the things that's so unfortunate about the timing of the current administration is that the Biden administration had actually started putting a lot of really good guidelines in place around AI regulation, and all of those things are being stripped out. So, we are going to see a world in which AI gets implemented without us spending any time thinking about like what might it do? Is this good? Is this bad? Right? Like
mhm.
we should be assessing these things. We should be assessing their environmental impacts. We should be assessing their impact on marginalized groups. We should be assessing their impacts on education and things like that before they're blindly implemented. So I don't know. It doesn't seem great.
Privacy is a thing you seem to only appreciate when it's gone. You know what I mean? It's sort of like It's
Yeah.
like one of these things that I think at least I know Caroline and I are, we're the in-betweeners, right? Grew up without the internet, and now that privacy is sort of disappearing, it's not just a nice thing to have, it's a necessary thing to have.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, people often have this impulse like, oh, young people don't care about privacy because they put things online, but every single person cares about their privacy. And privacy is pretty fundamental, I think, to people's development, people's sense of themselves as a citizen, as an actor, human dignity. And we gave away a lot of our private data to corporations. And we're at the point now where it's almost feel like we're trying to shut the barn door after the horse has already bolted, right? I do
Yeah.
think that the European privacy regulations are good. I think there are places and spaces where you might see some of these things changing. But again, I think this is a space where government regulation we would really benefit from that around data collection. We're at a point now where opting out is pretty much impossible. It's not just do I use Facebook, it's like do I drive a car in a city that has license plate cameras, right? Like do I
Right.
carry a cell phone in a world where there's basically no payphones anymore, right? So it's like
Right.
we no longer have these options to opt out of the system. So the only thing that we can do now is to make the system better.
That's very well
Yeah.
said.
Yeah.
That's very well said. 9 out of 10 apps. We were talking to a computer scientist, and I said I felt so proud that I knew this statistic that 9 out of 10 apps are tracking you once you've closed them. And his response, as opposed to, wow, that's a great statistic. He said, I'm just surprised it's not 10 out of 10.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think the thing that makes me feel better is the reason the internet has been so successful is because of people's desire for connection with other
Right.
people and people's curiosity and desire to learn about the world. And even as much as our attention spans are shot and our dopamine receptors are overloaded and we're all screen addicted, we still have those fundamental parts of our human nature intact. And I think that those are the things that are gonna lead us into if there is a better future, those are the things that are gonna allow us to achieve that.
That's awesome.
Yeah. I like that. I like that.
That's my feel good
This
after
is
all the
great.
real bad
Thank you.
stuff.
Then
That's
we
my
should
feel
end
good
it on that
statement.
one because
Yeah, we should end it on
that
that.
gave me hope again.
Yeah, all of a sudden, I'm like,
It gave us hope.
the Rocky theme started playing. That was great.
Yes. Yeah. I
All
love
right.
it.
Well, thank you
Well,
very, very much.
This
yeah.
was a great conversation. Thank you so much for your fantastic questions and the opportunity to chat with you today.
Yeah. Thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you for watching or listening to The Internet is Crack. Tune in next week when we have another great conversation about robotics, AI, and the internet. You can watch us or listen to us on YouTube or Spotify or many other outlets. And don't forget to follow us on social media. See you next Monday.